Good now. Okay, perfect. Awesome. That's what I was worried about. Amazing. We're getting started now. So if you haven't already read the slide, art workshops here provide intro-friendly courses for beginners. So make sure that you join the Art Workshops Discord channel so you can get updated whenever we have a new one. Today, our topic is UI and UX design. So first, let's get into what UI and UX really are and why they're so important. UI versus UX. What do they stand for? I'm sure you've heard them a lot, but you might not know what those are actually acronyms for. So UI is the user interface. It is the visual form of the game. It's all of the menus and buttons and things you can click. Having good UI means that your game is visually fun and appealing. It's the appearance of everything in your game. The UX is the user experience. It's the function of the game. Having good UX means that your game is easy and smooth to interact with. It means that it's easy to navigate different panels and that you can click on things and know where they're going to take you. They often get mixed up and confused, but they're quite different, and sometimes they actually work in opposition to each other. So it's important to know the difference and how they influence each other. So one example of good UI, and I'll bring this up a few times, as I'm sure that any UI video about games that you ever see on YouTube is going to bring up, Persona 5 has really, really famous and interesting UI. So it's stylish, it's interesting, it conveys the game's overall aesthetic and theme, which is exactly what you want in UI. For good UX, one example, okay, so this is a silly one, but it's a really good one. The skip intro button in Netflix, and also in Netflix, the watch credits and next episode button. So in games, these are like, you could imagine that these are things that are making the experience a lot easier for the user and usually causing more user retention and making the game more profitable in the long term for the developer. In Netflix, they have the skip intro button because it makes people want to immediately get into the content, so it's better for the user experience. But also it means that they don't get bored and leave Netflix, so it helps Netflix in the long run as well. So those kinds of buttons are an example of a really great user experience, even if they don't have a lot of UI flavor. Why does good UI matter? So good UI gives you a great first impression of a game and what the theme and the style and the aesthetic of the game is going to be in the long run. It's also a lot easier to play a game that has good UI because you're going to be able to quickly see where things are, things have high contrast, you know what buttons do. Having good UI also, from the developer aesthetic, improves the player retention. So if players are enjoying the UI of a game, then they're going to have a lot of fun coming back to the game and getting to see that art aesthetic that they liked before. Also, it's accessible to all users. It has readable contrast and understandable fonts, so accessibility is really important. You have a lot of people who have visual impairments, and having games that have high contrast is going to allow them to actually see what different parts of UI are going to do and make sure that they're able to navigate the game. Okay, so why does good UX matter? UX that's good prevents player frustration. It creates an immersive experience in the game through HUDs. Game systems become easier to learn with good UX, and also it's going to help, like your UI does, make your game accessible to all users. Like I was saying before, even though they go hand in hand, good UI does not always mean good UX. Having good stylish design doesn't automatically mean that UX is good. Vice versa, intuitive screens that have good UX don't immediately equal appealing artistic design. They can actually be at odds with each other. More attractive design often causes less readability. So pushing something with heavier UI design can actually make the UX more difficult because users aren't able to navigate easily. Okay, here is an example. What do you think, just looking at this, of the UI and UX of this game? It's pretty rough, right? Oh my gosh. Yikes. That's a yikes, because it's really hard to see what's going on. You can't see where the player is, you can't see where the characters are, and things like spells and maps are all confused. Trying to navigate this is rough, and if you look at it too long, you just start to get a headache, which is not helping the UI or the UX of the game. Here's a different example. Minecraft. What do you think of the UI and UX of this menu? It might not be super stylish if you compare it to something like Persona 5, but it's definitely functional. And as for UI, it sells the effect of the game. This is crafting, this is an inventory system. You can tell what in this game is supposed to be accomplished. So this is actually an example of pretty good UI and UX. There's some problems with the alignment. It's weird that the crafting menu has this weird separation from the player, and then the distance here isn't nearly equal. But, you know, it's charming, it's nostalgic, and we all immediately recognize it as Minecraft, so it's effective. New example, what do you think of the UI in Monster Hunter Wilds? Just first impressions, UI, UX feeling. There are some successes here. The map is able to clearly convey where the player is and what's around the player. You've got the stamina bar and the health bar in the top left. You can easily see what's going on there. But in my opinion, at least, and UI is all going to be opinion-based. You're going to have general feelings, but some people might really like UI and some people might really not. And that just comes down to personal taste. I think that this is a little bit confused for what you've got going on. I think all the Monster Hunter games sometimes struggle from this. In the bottom right, you've got a really big menu with a lot going on. In other parts of the map, you've got strange collections of things. So, for example, what I'm talking about is like in the bottom left, you've got a map. You've got Paratoad above it. You've got daytime at the bottom left, but it says daytime there, and then at the top right you've also got a clock. So if you look at it all together, it's all a little bit confusing. Okay, so in conclusion, Monster Hunter UI, some aesthetics are good, some things might be a little confused. Everyone's going to have different opinions. Let's go into one of my personal favorites, and I'm very biased. Like I said, UI can be really biased. The EGaDS UI. So here you're choosing different boons to level up your character in the middle of the game after you've achieved a boon. I think this is a really good mix of the aesthetic that comes with UI. It sells the game. Everything has a consistent vibe and appearance, but at the same time, the UX is really good. You've just got 3 options in the middle. It says choose one at the top. It's going to really easily be that you can click on one and progress. Okay. So now that we talked about first impressions, and don't worry, I'll be going over how to tell what is good UI or UX later, but how can we start to think about making good UI and UX? How can we start to take the basic stuff that we're mocking up in Unity and make it feel a little bit more professional? So, when you're making UI and UX, you want to consider the 7 principles of UI design. So 7 things, here we go. Hierarchy, progressive disclosure, consistency, contrast, accessibility, proximity, and alignment. It's very similar to the general common principles of graphic design and visual art, so that applies both ways. If you're looking into making visual art for just art's sake, you're going to still want to think about form and your balance of colors and your balance of line and aesthetic, and that all transfers over to working on graphic design. And then vice versa, making stuff in UI and UX, that transfers over to art design. Those aesthetics are going to be transferable. So yeah, if you have any art knowledge, that's going to help you here. Hierarchy. Hierarchy is the visual implied order of importance of elements on the user's screen. Good hierarchy is going to help out the user as much as possible. It's going to tell them where they're supposed to look and how they're supposed to interact with the screen. Hierarchy lets them recognize key information, so it's going to emphasize any really important part of a singular screen. It's going to help the user distinguish from less important elements, and it's going to consider font size, contrast, and spacing. So here's a really simple example. Instead of looking at a really complicated game UI, let's just look at this menu where you're ordering food. First screen. The obvious biggest visual hierarchy is, in my opinion, the burger at the top and then the checkout button at the bottom right. So that's showing the user, this is what you got. Here's an image of it, really big. That's the most important thing to look at. And then second, the most important thing to do is take the action of checkout. So checkout is highlighted in orange. So talking about hierarchy. Hello? keep having people just stepping in and then stepping out. Hierarchy. Hierarchy in games is going to consider which parts of the screen you're supposed to look at first. So when we were talking about that fast food app, you're looking at the burger first because the burger is the most emphasized. On this screen, what do you look at first? Take a second and think about which part of the screen immediately draws your eye. It's not that hard because it's that big, bold font right in the middle. A new frontier. You have just unlocked a new quest and it's displaying at the center of your screen, really big and bold. If this UI had the text below it, the Explore the European Dead Zone, at the same size as a new frontier, then it was going to be really confusing about what you're supposed to look at first, and they aren't going to know what the title of the quest is or the recommended power. So with this one, they're able to quickly see what they're looking at. Think about it as you're communicating, you're talking directly to your viewer. If you were going to explain this screen to me and how you want it to work, you would say, oh, I want the user to see a quest called A New Frontier. When you're translating that to UI, you want to think about, okay, so we're supposed to make a quest that says A New Frontier. It's going to be the biggest thing. It's going to have the most hierarchy. Progressive disclosure. Progressive disclosure is providing the right amount of information and not any unnecessary extra at each step of a user's experience to allow them to progress. So that's pretty wordy, but let me break down what it actually means. You want to avoid overwhelming or frustrating the user. At the same time, you want to make sure the users have an idea of how much they have left to do. So when you're working on a game, you want to think about what pieces the user actually has to know at each moment in order to progress forward. So if they're clicking on a menu, they don't need to see all their character statistics if that isn't the menu they clicked on. If they clicked the pause button, they probably want to see the option to return to the game, the option to exit the game, maybe the option to look at settings, but you don't need to give them all of the other information at the same time. In fact, actually taking less information and putting it on the screen when it's more important is going to help your player a lot more. Finally, tutorials. So tutorials are a really good example of this. When you go through a tutorial in a game, it has different steps along the process, and each step is going to consider how much you know from the step before. So, for example, if you open up, a game like Candy Crush Saga, they're not going to give you every single bit of information on one massive scrolling page and then expect you to absorb immediately all of that information, because the user will either skip it and then not know how to play the game, or they'll get frustrated, slowly start to try to read it, and then leave. You have to give them little bits at a time, like you're drip feeding the information. So this example that I put up on the screen is that they're saying that when you're in the air, you can tap and hold to glide slowly to the ground. They're not making the user absorb anything else. They're giving them that singular bit of information, which is all they need to know in order to press the X and try it out themselves. So one example of progressive disclosure that I thought of when I was trying to make this slideshow that shows good UI in games is the League of Legends drafting screen. First, you have your normal draft screen where you can see your party setup, but you aren't going to have anything pop up until you find a match. When you find a match, the entire screen goes dark, and you have only in the middle of your screen a big button that says accept or decline. There's no other information you need at this moment. You don't need to know who your opponents are. You don't need to know what characters they've chosen. You only need to know that you can either press that accept button or you can decline. So that's a really great example of progressive disclosure. Here's another example of progressive disclosure. Signing in to an application. So this is less fun, this is less about games, but it's equally relevant. When you're signing into a form or you're completing a large bit of like form fill out for a doctor's office, something like that, you're going to have multiple different screens, and on each screen you fill out information that's relevant and then you say next screen. There's a reason why there aren't 50 screens all piled up on top of each other into one, because it's going to look like this monstrosity. I bet you've had to fill out a form like that at some point before, and it was awful. You want to be able to see how many different screens and stages you're going to have to go into, but you want it to be broken up into digestible chunks. That's what I was saying here about make sure the users have an idea of how much they have left to do. It would be really great if you had a progress bar that's actually telling the users how much they have to get done before they're completed with whatever this stage is. So if you had a tutorial, having a progress bar of the tutorial until the user gets to leave the tutorial and actually join the game would be super helpful. Okay, So now that we've talked about all that, moving on to the next element, which is consistency. You want to create a brand with a sense of familiarity across your entire game. So you can achieve this by having a consistent color palette and consistent font choices. Everything should look like it's from the same game. No matter where someone takes a screenshot of your game, people should be able to look at that screenshot and be able to identify which game it's from. Also, users will immediately notice differences in your game. If you have a button that's a lot bigger than the rest on a screen, that's inconsistent. Users are going to think of other earlier screens where you didn't have that and wonder what has changed or what's different about this. Users that are game players have really been trained to be able to recognize those kinds of patterns because usually that's conveying something. So if there isn't a reason for something to be different on a screen, it should be the same as the brand that you've been using the entire time. Okay, I've got a whole lot of pictures from Persona 5 here, and here's why. I talked about how it was famous before, and I fear it will come up multiple times again. You can't talk about Game UI without mentioning Persona 5. But they've got fantastic consistency, and actually a really limited color palette. You've got multiple shades of red, and almost a pure white and pure black, and that's it. They're not suddenly throwing in a blue screen, or a... Actually, I'm just realizing there is a screen where there's a lot of blue. But it's still within the artistic style and aesthetic of the game. It's really clearly a Persona game if you see a screen like this. So they've almost like owned that aesthetic. And that's what you want across your game. You want your game to have that kind of consistency that players can recognize and want to come back to. So the side note on Persona 5, the reason I keep bringing it up, it's famous for its UI and UX. It's developed by the company Atlas. It has an incredibly unique design that set a standard for the industry, and it's always going to be brought up in UI game conversation. So more on this later. Contrast. So you want to use natural differences to draw the user's attention when you're thinking about game UI. You want to think about sizing, color, shape, lighting, and lots of other techniques and art design that can create contrast. It ties in with visual hierarchy, and it provides the user's information visually by having your choice of smart colors, shapes, or sizes. So in this example here, you've got a HUD. The characters on the screen have health bars above them, and they have symbols and icons and their names. Those stand out from the surrounding background so that you're able to actually see what's going on. If those health bars were a really washed out, muted brown-green that camouflaged with the background, it would be really difficult to see what level their health was at. So that's why the HUD will usually have a higher contrast and the background will have a more muted color than in other games. That games in general will usually have more muted colors in the background and have more vibrant HUDs so that it's easier for players to see what's going on. By the way, if you don't know, HUD stands for heads-up display. So that is the overlay of UI on the player screen that actually displays over the world in a game. So here's an example of contrast in a character menu. You've got an example of these bright colors being used as the key contrast point. They're saying Overload is the ability that you've got the skill Restless, and your eye is immediately drawn to the highest contrast sections. So, for example, you've got this skill point section in the center that has a bright pink highlight. That's the one that the user currently has selected or currently has a level up ability inside of. So you're immediately drawn to that section. And having a really bright contrast of the pink against this dark background means that users are going to be able to quickly see what's going on the screen and which sections they're able to interact with or click on. Here's an example of an issue with contrast in a game. So this is a picture from Valorant. It was an in-game screenshot where a player was complaining on Reddit that the in-game HUD was difficult to see with light backgrounds. So you can see that they chose a very pale color as the overlay, but when you're generally looking at a very light background, it's going to be really difficult to see those numbers, especially for someone who would have a visual impairment. They probably chose this level of color because they didn't want to distract the player when they're trying to do something like aim at another player. And also, a lot of the backgrounds have darker colors, so if the player was looking down, they wouldn't have that issue. So they had to choose a color, and they likely chose that this was going to work the best, but it can still cause issues in certain settings. Accessibility. So talking about contrast ties really well into accessibility. Accessibility means being visually inclusive to all users, like those with visual impairments, and making the experience easier for anyone. You want to ensure that your fonts are readable, that you don't put light text on a light background and make things difficult to see. The WCAG, or the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, are a publicly available set of guidelines towards making your content digitally much more approachable to people who may have visual impairments. So that's a really good thing to look at if you're designing a game, in order to make sure that the colors or fonts that you're choosing are actually going to be approachable for all sorts of people. And you want to consider visual clarity in your games. So making things difficult to see or understand is going to cause trouble for any user, visual impairment or not. So it's very important that you're going to try to make your game approachable to anyone, because that's how you get people to come back and keep playing it. Accessibility menus are something that a lot of games have. So they might have a colorblind mode that you can turn on. So those are really cool. They increase the contrast, or they adjust colors depending on someone's color blindness. It's going to allow them to play the game easier. If you have a room and the only way to tell which item is going to solve the puzzle is the color of the item, you're not thinking about accessibility. That's not exactly UI, but I think it's important to think about. Also, they might have options like subtitles, turning them on or off, giving the subtitles a background, changing the subtitle size in order to support all sorts of players. Proximity. When you work on proximity, you're placing elements that are related to each other near each other. So you're grouping similar buttons, like a pause menu, a back button, an escape button. And you can see that on this example on the right at the top, I have all of these little buttons that are somewhat related. That's all going to be thinking about proximity. Also, you want to have different menus that make sense and categories that users are used to seeing. This is going to help you with UX flow. So if you have different categories next to each other that are really similar, or users might need to use back to back, it's going to make a lot of sense that they're put directly next to each other, because the user isn't going to have to move their mouse that much in order to click on different sections. They're going to be able to quickly back to back press all the little pieces that they need. Also, proximity should use expectations that users have from other media. So you don't want to put your pause button in the middle of your screen, because everyone will be really, really confused. You want to put your pause button in the top corner, because that's what people have seen in other games, and they're going to look there when they're playing your game, even if they've never played it before, because that's a standard that's been set in the industry. Alignment, lining up elements in a scene. You want to consider as if there is an overall grid over the entire scene. Everything should be sitting on that grid and lined up with each other. You want to avoid drawing attention to areas on accident by using unusual alignment. So immediately in this image on the right, which is really simplified, but you look right at that part that says not aligned, because it's sticking out, it's different. Users' eyes are always drawn to whatever part of your screen is different. Additionally, it increases visual satisfaction. So not just in UI, in art also, when alignment is really nice, it's something that's satisfying to look at. A lot of satisfying videos on the internet involve lining things up nicely, or having things that are just exactly the same size, because it's something that humans find nice to look at. So you want to think about that when you're making your UI, because it's going to make it easier and more fun for players. So here's an example of good alignment. You can see that the space in between each of these panels is exactly the same, and also the panels are the same height and width. Up here, these are all in line, the top corner is in line, these players at the bottom are in line, the size of each icon is the same. If for some reason one of these icons was larger than the others, you would immediately think that there's something different about it, and there's a reason that it's been emphasized in that way. Like maybe that's the MVP of the match. So you can use a lack of alignment in order to draw attention to something. Like right here, you can see that this person has a larger and brightly colored contrasted menu because they are important. But right here, these others are not trying to be highlighted in that way, so you want the alignment to be the same. UX and flow. Wow, that was a lot. We went over all of the different principles of UI and UX design, and now we're moving on to just UX flow. Flow diagrams, they're an industry standard. They're really important for UX design. They're going to be a layout of all of the screens in your game and arrows demonstrating how each screen flows into the other one. You want to prepare before you make your game. You want to save time during your creation process. Also, you want to track user interaction with your game. So, what do I mean by this? If you work on anything, if you work on code, if you work on art, you always want to have a plan and a sketch in advance. That doesn't mean that we always do it, but it's really helpful if you do have it. Having that type of plan allows you to see how the user is going to interact with your game. So with UX flowcharts, you're going to be drawing out how the user is able to navigate. Every single menu that they're able to go to should show which direction they move through it. So if you have a main menu, you might move into, in this example, a collection, quest, or credits menu, and then you can only go back from those menus into the main menu. But there's an option by that dotted line to go from the collection directly into the currency shop, right here. So you can see that there are multiple options for the user. Mapping something out like this is going to actually make the implementation of your game a lot easier, because when you have to go code, if you're doing the code and the back-end side of this, then having a plan on how you want everything to flow into each other and actually transition between screens or pop-ups is really important. So I brought up this example. How fast can you recognize what game this is? This is a flowchart for. This is more of a gameplay flowchart, but if you imagine it being a UI flowchart, this is possible also. It's rock, paper, scissors! Yeah, that's really easy. But you're going to have your round start. Immediately they have to go into making a decision. Then the game will check if they had the same pick, if they won. These could all be different pop-ups on your screen. And you can actually use this type of gameplay in order to influence what type of UI you want to have pop up. Going back into only showing the user a little bit at a time, it's really important that you think about how much they need to know at each screen. On the decision time screen, where they choose between rock, paper, and scissors, they don't have to have any other options up there. They just need to know if they're picking rock, paper, or scissors. UX and flow, the 3-click rule is important in games and something that people talk about a lot, where the user should be able to access anything that they want in your game within 3 clicks. They shouldn't have to do more than that to get into a menu. There's a game, what's it called? Where Winds Meet, that I tried for a minute, but it is awful with menus. It's got stacked about 20 menus inside of each other, and I couldn't do it. The UI was atrocious. In a lot of really well-made games, they do actually follow this rule, and there are only 3 clicks that you need in order to access something. If you're getting into more clicks than that, it's going to be pretty hard for the user to access whatever they're looking for. A call to action is something that you would also see in a game. It is a match now, or start, or upgrade, or level up, or any sort of button that calls the user to click on it or do something. On this screen, you could say that this exit button at the bottom right would be a call to action. They can exit if they want to, and that's the button they need to press to do it. You also want to think about mouse movements across your screen. You want to minimize distance in between different sections that the user has to click. You don't want the user to have to be dragging their mouse across the entire screen to click different sections. You want to put those sections next to each other. So that's another thing with grouping like elements. It's important that they're able to quickly select different options if they want to. So in this example, if you wanted to switch between weapons and armor, which are both very related if you were trying to change your character's equipment or loadout, they're next to each other. So you could click here and then click here, and actually you've got the option of L1 and R1 to navigate, so you have more controller accessibility if you want it. Figma. Figma is a super awesome software and tool for UI and UX design for web programs or games. It's the industry standard in the field. It allows you to, with a lot of creativity, design UI and UX and plan out your experiences. So if you wanted to, after you made that really helpful flow diagram that I talked about, you could then go into Figma and design that type of interface. Once you're in Figma, you can select between how you want the elements to interact, the animations on them, how you want them to flow into each other, and mock up whatever design you want to make. And then if you're lucky, you get to pass off all of your Figma work to your poor Unity programmer, who then has to try to implement all of your wonderful designs. Choosing fonts. I'm giving this its own category because it's pretty important. Font options. When you get into a game, you immediately are going to have a feeling about what the game might be like based on its UI and what fonts it's using. You might have, and you might not realize it, but you definitely have first reaction, gut reaction to different fonts based on how they make you feel, kinds of fonts that you've seen before, or how you've seen them implemented in a game before. So here's some really simple examples. This font feels strong. This one feels playful. This one feels classic. And those might not be exactly the same across the world or just across different people, but they're a pretty good basis for the types of feelings that you want a font to evoke from someone, or the emotions that you might want to fit into your game. If your game is really lighthearted, like Candy Crush, you're going to use that bubbly, playful font. You're not going to use some jagged, aggressive font because that wouldn't make any sense with the theme of your game. So, based on that, we're going to play a font game. The best kind of game, a font game. Here's a font. What's your gut feeling? What's the first reaction you have to this font? If you played a game and this was the screen that said party setup, what kind of game is that? Think about that. And people in Twitch, if you want to put it in chat, please let me know what you think. Yeah, if no one puts it in chat, it's going to be my opinion. I think that this feels a little bit punk, modern, playful. I think it feels exciting. I think that skate park is a really good name for it because it has a little bit of edginess and danger to it. I would expect this in a type of game that's going to be a little bit fun and playful with an edge. This kind of font. So you've got bubbly, playful letters. Sorry if you hear vacuuming behind me. Someone's vacuuming right in the hall behind me. Bubbly, playful letters. How do these make you feel? What's your first gut reaction? And I know this seems a little silly, but when you get to the point where you're choosing a font for a game, you'll often find that you start doubting yourself and what fonts convey. So I think it's fun to talk about. So a bubbly, lighthearted, playful style font. This font. How does this make you feel? If you played a game and all of the character names were in this font, what types of characters do you think they'd be? To me, this font feels a little bit magical. It almost feels runic. You don't have any straight lines anywhere. Even the X is a little bit tilted. So it almost feels like ink blots to me. I think it feels artistic. I think it feels creative and imaginative. Maybe it could be a little bit scary if they used it in certain contexts. Like, think about this kind of font on a crumpled up old yellowed note in the back of a haunted house. That'd be pretty spooky. But also, if it was used to write out the names of different spells in a wizardy game, that would give you the feeling of something magic and imaginative and unique and creative. How about this one? Very edgy, gothic. What kind of game do you think this would be from? Probably something a little bit dramatic, maybe an RPG of some sort. I bet it has some kind of gothic theming. I bet it's a little bit dramatic. And I bet that there's some dark themes in there. Last font, I'll start skipping through these. This is the last one. A little bit minimalist, a little bit almost cyberpunk if you imagine it in neon lights. It could have a feeling of being peaceful because of all of that even line work and round edges, but I think it almost feels a little bit more sci-fi. Font pairings. So now you know what fonts mean or how they make you feel, but how are you going to pair them up? Because that's actually one of the biggest challenges of UI and UX design. One bit of advice that I was given by the teachers in my typography and games class is that you want to pair up a font with a lot of personality with a font that's very readable. So what this lets you do is have a font that's going to be used for titles or character names or for your game's logo that has a lot of pizzazz and personality to it and really sells the story and identity of your game visually. But also, you want to have a font that fits in with it that is really readable, because that font is going to allow you to have a lot of text in a row. It's going to let users be able to read what's going on without getting confused or bogged down in a really complicated font. And if they fit together well, this will work really nicely. So here's an example of someone who had a really dramatic cyber metal font, but then a really readable font below it. You want to be really cautious when you're choosing fonts of any recognizable fonts, because remember, you're making your games accessible to everyone, and that includes graphic designers. If they play your game and they see Comic Sans at the top of every single page, they might cry. You might hurt their feelings. So really think about what fonts you're choosing in your game and make sure it's not something that's going to be immediately recognized. Something like Papyrus or Impact or even Georgia maybe would be really quickly recognizable. Please don't put Arial in your game. Okay, font licensing. So now you have some fonts that you absolutely love, you've got your heart set on them, but you need a specialized license to purchase fonts for games. Even if you have something like Adobe Fonts, that doesn't mean you can just download and use that font in your Adobe project. A lot of times when you're making a game, you have to embed the font, which is more expensive. It means that the font file is in the game when it's shipped. So if you paid a whole lot of money to be able to use Comic Sans in your game, you're going to have to pay that fee for the embedded license so that when your game ships, it has that .ttf or .otf font file in the game, and you have to pay money for that. The price greatly increases when you're creating editable by user text. So whatever font that you're using for players being able to put in their character name or players being able to type in chat, that font is going to be a lot more expensive. So a good idea is that whatever font you're using for that type of text, you want to look for something that's completely open source, that they will allow you to embed in your game. Unless you're like really rich and you want to go buy some really fancy Font Foundry's exclusive font, like go for it. I would love to be able to do that. But if you're working with a lower budget or an indie studio, open source fonts are the way. Creating custom fonts. So maybe you decided you don't want to deal with all of this licensing crap and you just want to go into creating custom fonts on your own. There are websites that allow you to create your own font designs, usually with varying price ranges and amounts of characters. FontStruct and Calligrapher are both popular options. If you're working with this, I would recommend Illustrator or Photoshop for your text design. So on the right, here is a font sheet where you can see that someone is writing out in their own handwriting different letters. So after this font sheet is created, they'll upload it to, they're using myscriptfont.com. I haven't checked that out, so I can't vouch for how good it is. But they would upload this sheet, and then the website would scan each letter in a box, and it would line them all up and create a font. After you create it, there's a lot of little settings that you'd need to tweak, like where the baseline of each letter is going to sit, the height of the letter, tons of technical things like kerning, but it's not too bad. I've done it before in a class. However, I think that if you're not a professional font designer, or especially if you don't know how to use Adobe Illustrator or Photoshop, it's going to be pretty difficult to make a font that looks professional enough to use in your game. If your game is maybe a little bit more of a cozy game or relaxed or lighthearted, using something like a handwriting font might be easier, or it might not clash with the game so much. This is definitely an option, but I wouldn't recommend it immediately if you have no experience with it. Okay, a note on World Space UI. Designing World Space UI means that you have UI that is actually in the 3D world in your game. Having World Space UI allows you to put things that are able to be seen from different angles. It gives your UI a perspective appearance. Here's another example of World Space UI. World Space UI in general in games should probably be used when you have a bit more of a handle on normal UI at first, but I do think it is a really cool thing to know exists. If you have something like a menu that you want to be popping up from a character's sci-fi wristband, having something like World Space UI might be a really cool way to show that. Here's how you do it. In Unity, if that's where you're implementing it, you can set your canvas's render mode to world space. So if you haven't worked on UI in Unity before, you're going to have a canvas object. It's usually really massive, way bigger than whatever scene you're looking at. And then you build objects on top of that canvas. So they're all treating the canvas as their parent, and they're sitting inside of it. So you might have buttons, you might have large panels, you might have text objects or Text Mesh Pro objects, and those are all sitting inside of your canvas. But if you change that canvas to world space, it's going to be present inside of the world. So like this example here. And then you want to drag your main camera into the event camera field. So into the event camera field is going to let you see, when you're looking at it, the world space UI through the user's camera. Okay, Persona 5 case study. So now I want to go into, I know I was talking about Persona 5 a lot, but I want to go into looking at this UI and how it might be helpful as a reference, because it is really famous for a reason. So let me just pop this up here. Oh yeah, okay, awesome, it is showing up. I do not have YouTube Premium on here. Okay, so here is a Persona 5 menu. So not only are they implementing all of this really good hierarchy and contrast, they're also really thinking about how you're going to make the user's experience with different animations really nice. So they're using this flow of letting screens move into each other or flip across the page, and that's directing your eye. It's a little bit busy when you look at it really quickly, someone flipping through menus like this, but it is an aesthetic that is really fast and easily recognizable as Persona 5. So let me get that off. Okay. So let me break down how in Persona 5 they're using UI, and let's compare it to all of those different aesthetic ideas that we talked about earlier and see how well it fits each of them. So before we talked about hierarchy, in this scene, how good do you think the hierarchy is? Do you think it lives up to the standard of this being famous? You can see that immediately, in my perspective, my eye is drawn to all of the different menu options next to the main character. The order, persona, gun options all have really high contrast because they've got a single letter that's highlighted in a different color and they're putting straight white next to straight black. So that's where my eye is first drawn. You've also got bright red behind them, and in comparison to at the top, like the pixie isn't as bold of a type, and also the letters are a little further apart, so you're not getting as high of a feeling of contrast as you do with those options next to the player. The options next to the player, when you press those buttons, that's your interaction, that's your call to action. Most likely in this scene, the player is going to be interacting with all of those buttons next to the character the most of anything. So that's the part that you want to emphasize and highlight the most. Progressive disclosure. In the game, why I wanted to show you that video so that you could see how things flow into each other is because of progressive disclosure. If you're pressing the system option, it's going to bring up the menu on the right. So they could have, if they wanted to, put all of these on this screen. It could have said system and then story, tutorial, config, data load, data save, return to, that could have been all right here. But that's going to overwhelm the viewer. You have already got so much going on here visually. They're trying to think about how each section is going to flow into each other. So once you press system, then you get to see all these options. If you press party, you'll get to see party options. And then they've got animations that highlight each of those. Even on this screen, you've got the hand serving as a focus that's drawing your eye to this menu right here. The bright red is the brightest red of anywhere on the screen. Even this I don't think is quite as bright as this, and especially not when contrasted by the bright white and black next to it. So your eye is looking right here at what you've selected. And then when you click, it brings you to a new menu. Progressive disclosure. All right, I'm going to take a quick drink of water, but think about the consistency in this design while I do. Okay. In this image on the far left, this is a picture from the actual game. This is a canon in-game implemented menu. and it has consistency, as I'm sure you've seen, with all the other menus that I showed you from the game. However, these two pictures on the right, this is a fan-designed image, and this here is an image of someone's phone that they designed to look like Persona 5. Now, the reason I put this up here is because I wanted to show you that these menus were not made by this game. But if you saw this, I mean, this one has a picture of him, but this, if you saw this, you would immediately think, if you knew this game, that this is a Persona 5 art style implementation. And the reason is because it has such a clear visual style that's consistent across the whole game that it can actually be applied to other formats, and you're still going to recognize it as the game that it's from. So that is a really highly successful example of consistency. Moving on to contrast. In this image here, you have really bright white against really dark black. Now that's the highest contrast that you can get, but even in that contrast, they're drawing your eye to the most important sections. You've got black against white next to the word for the menu that you're on. You've got the highest contrast black and white and little images next to each other for the different items that you can select in this option. So they're using contrast, I'd say, throughout the entire game with the black and white to draw your eye to whatever sections they want you to look at. Additionally, they're using contrast right here. Do you see this? This is a different color than anywhere else on the screen. There's a pale yellow, a bright teal, and a bright red. They're not using this teal anywhere else on the screen because that is where the user's mouse is hovering. This is the section that they're trying to select. If you're hovering there, that's going to let you see where your mouse currently is on the screen. Being able to immediately recognize the section of the screen that the user is on is really important, so they're thinking about the contrast with that. Accessibility. There are, as far as I could find when I searched about Persona 5, no custom accessibility controls in the game. It does have a brightness feature in the options menu, and it does have subtitles for the cutscenes, but according to the internet, they're not always reliable. I found this really cool link right here to a website called Can I Play That?, where people with disabilities like hearing or visual impairments write about how accessible a game is for them. So this might be a really good resource if you want to check out popular games and see how they might apply different methods to be accessible. Persona 5 seemed like it wasn't too bad in terms of accessibility because it does have really high contrast, but I could see that all of the visual noise and busyness might be hard. Proximity. Okay, this is a bit of a different color, but it is still from Persona 5, and this is a weapons shop. So they're using proximity here in two different ways. The first way, visually, is that they've put all of the different options for things that you can buy immediately next to each other. Even if they're not stacked nicely, you've got your options right here, so you know that you can choose to buy different things here. You don't have to click on different parts of the screen to buy. You've got a clustered section. The other way that they're using proximity is in the game, you've got different shops that sell different things. This is a weapon shop. Any sort of weapons that the user wants to interact with, if they want to sell their weapons, if they want to buy weapons, they will have to go to this section in the game. So there's a cluster of UI that they can interact with that is only related to weapons, that is available only at this spot in the game. So they've chosen that this UI is only accessible in this spot in the 3D world. They could have had the player able to open a UI menu and then go to the shop option anywhere in the entire game, but they didn't do that. Because avoiding doing that is letting them have clearer UI that is only focused on one singular topic. Shout out to the contrast right here on the sell button. You can see that they've got a really bright yellow. When you sell something, you're having a different action than the rest of these buy options here. So that's highlighted, so you know that it's a different choice. Alignment. This is an interesting one with Persona 5 because they don't use traditional alignment. Things are not lined up nicely in boxed areas or clear lines. Instead, they have a lot of diagonal lines and unclean edges, and that's an aesthetic of the game. I wouldn't say unclean edges, but more jagged, not geometric. But an interesting example of this is that in both of these, everything might be tilted because that's an aesthetic of the game, but the important sections that you need to read are actually still horizontal. Even though this entire phone here is on a sharp tilt, you can see that the boxes that you're going to read and the text inside is still aligned horizontally. Even though it might seem like the game has really off-kilter design, if you just made everything tilted sideways without having a clear plan with it or a professional design idea, it might be really hard to see what's going on. And then also here, even though this is all tilted, it is still actually aligned horizontally. And also, it might be a bit of a diagonal alignment along each of these. You can see that the distance between each one is the same, except for the one that's selected right now, even though it might seem like it's not aligned on first look. Review! We just went over a lot of interesting Persona 5 UI. What do you think? Does it deserve all the hype? Did it meet your expectations? I'd love to hear in chat if anyone thinks it deserves or doesn't deserve the hype. I would love a debate about the hype of the game. Okay, I'm getting no direct responses, so... Oh, deserves! Deserves, thank you. I think it does too. I think it deserves the hype. And there's no dissenting opinion, so clearly, yeah, it's still so strong. To this day, it's the best in the industry. There's nothing that compares with it. Okay. I actually want to talk about some other games. So I'm going to put up some UI menus, and I want you to think about all of those different elements that we talked about. I want you to think about the hierarchy. I want you to think about how elements are aligned or grouped. This first one here is actually by the same studio as Persona 5 is. This is from the game Metaphor ReFantazio. So looking at this game here, what do you think about this UI menu? I think it's really artistic. I think that it has a really interesting choice of fonts. Things are using like multiple different fonts in here, which is interesting. You've got this more rough, jagged font, and then you've got this flowy font where all of the letters aren't aligned along a baseline. You've also got really high contrast on the part that you've selected. Instead of white, it's black. And then the background behind it is this really bright red to show which section that you're... Yeah, the contrast on the selected option, yes, it is a vibrant contrast. You've got a bright red next to a very dark black. And then every single option on this menu draws your eye in a different way. And I think that there's some really interesting choices here where these are all aligned along a circle in the background. You can see the circle here. And if your eye follows them to go down along this circle, you hit Y, which is an option that you can select, and then you hit this line, and that brings you up to this. So I think this is like a masterclass in UI layout. Yeah, the line cutting through, it's so satisfying to look at, and that is an example of really satisfying alignment, because you've actually got this line here that is affecting different things on the screen. And it's highlighting the character's face in a way that isn't affecting your ability to navigate through the UI. If you get the chance, you should look up Metaphor ReFantazio UI and just watch how it moves, because the animation is insane. Here is another example of UI. So what do you feel when you look at this UI? What is the vibe, the energy? Do you think the hierarchy is good? It's definitely not as flashy as Persona 5, but I think it's also really effective. Yeah, it's definitely playful. It's definitely got like a happy vibe to it. You can see that the colors are really friendly. Metaphor ReFantazio felt edgy and dangerous, and this one feels a bit, yeah, the rounded rectangles feels playful, maybe a bit friendly for children, childlike, warm. It's a nice feeling. This one here, if you recognize this game, I think this one is an interesting conversation about UI, because I do think that the UI is a little bit at odds with some of the gameplay aesthetics. If you don't know the game, this is from the game Subnautica. And if you know anything about Subnautica, it has a bit of a reputation for being very spooky. There's a lot of stuff in the depths, and it's going to get you. But even though it has that spooky feeling to it, it has a lot of round edges. You've got round shapes, you've got friendly-looking fonts. And I think that what they're going for, or at least what they've achieved, is a really strong contrast between the aesthetic of the game and the gameplay of the game and the UI. And I think that maybe they're trying to go for it being almost a little bit more disturbing because the UI is a bit more friendly. I think the hierarchy is really good here. At the top of the screen, you've got immediately, I think that you notice that the depth is low. So there's a bright red next to the user's depth. And then at the bottom left, you've got different elements like your oxygen and your health, and those are all grouped together nicely, so those are all related, and that's why they're all next to each other. Yeah, this is a really readable screen. Moving on, do you recognize this game? What do you think and feel about the UI that you see here? So this is UI from Elden Ring, which won Game of the Year, so it must be decent, right? The title has good hierarchy. You can see where it says Castleward Tunnel, that's highlighted behind it. The text is in a brighter color, so you've got contrast immediately there. The button that you've selected, which right now for this player is Past Time, is highlighted because it's got a color behind it. You can tell which part they've selected. And then I think that the UI is nice because it's a bit unintrusive in the scene. It's dark colors, which fits the darker, grungy aesthetic of Elden Ring. And then in the background, you've got a brighter color around the character and around the rest point that they're at. So the UI is more like a HUD. It's not interfering too much with the visuals in the scene. Yeah, I think that maybe they could have used, and yeah, it looks more basic than the games itself. Yeah, exactly. And I think it is a little bit interesting that they have all of these different options on this one menu. That it's pastime, level up, flask, memorize spell, mix wondrous physic, sort chest. I do think that maybe it would have been nice if the leave button was a little bit further away than the other one, since it's a different type of interaction or a different color. Or maybe the options like memorize spell, sort chest, level up could all be in some sort of secondary like player inventory screen, because this is a lot of options just in a row for the player. But still, it is in fact effective in the scene, and I think that the font is it feels a bit more fantasy or dramatic. It's got some edges to it. Okay, this is one of the last ones that I wanted to talk about. So this game's HUD has a different approach than a lot I've seen. This game's called Split Fiction. And probably the first thing that you'd notice about the HUD is that there isn't one. There's no HUD in this game. This game is all about interaction with the other player. So it's a co-op game. If you haven't played it, please do. So good. But in the game, they've chosen not to implement a HUD. So I think that this game poses an interesting question of, do we really need that HUD? When we talked about Monster Hunter earlier, we have a ton of different options on the screen all the time. Are those options actually necessary for your game? Before you go and implement all of those different options, like a mini-map and multiple different bars and your inventory and all the level ups you've gotten onto your HUD, maybe ask yourself if your game needs it, because this is a highly successful game and it has no HUD. Instead, what they've chosen is to use the player's like visual screen and appearance and what they're seeing around them to communicate everything that they need to know. Instead, they have a like red appearance that appears at the edges of the screen when you're injured. There's no health bar. There's just varying degrees of redness at the edges of the screen until you die and respawn. Okay, we've talked about everything. It's activity time. everyone on the Twitch, I expect you to participate. You need to get out a piece of paper and a device to search Google on. You're about to be given a UI prompt from an important client. Now, I know this seems silly, but I do think that while you have it all fresh in your brain, maybe it would be fun to think about how you could use this to actually think about UI design. Are you ready? Do you have your paper? Do you have your Google? The important client approaches. Your challenge. Amy, that's Amy. She's designing a game about protecting nature. She wants you to design a heads-up display that will convey peaceful, natural energy and include a health bar, mana bar, minimap, and any other features you think it needs. You have 10 minutes. Go. I had planned to set a timer and run this in person, but in my current setting, there's actually no one in person today, unfortunately. Hopefully a lot of people will watch this later. But because there's no one in person, I don't think that you need me to sit around for 10 minutes and run this challenge because there's no one that I'll be able to talk to or evaluate their work after. So if you're watching from home, or if you're watching this later, I really highly recommend that you give this a try and just see how it works out for you, because I think that could be pretty fun. So just imagine that 10 minutes have passed. I'm imagining that you paused the video if you're watching this later. Amazing job. I wonder what you learned or what you thought about making UI yourself. I found that when I actually sat down and tried to make UI, that a lot of the things that I thought would be easy were actually pretty difficult. I think the most difficult one was font choice. I hadn't expected that for the game I'm making with my friends, I would need to spend about 2 hours digging the entire internet for fonts that were both open source and easy to use, but also fit the game's aesthetic and paired well together. That was a battle. That's something that you might not anticipate being a bit of a challenge, and then in the end it really is one. Okay. Thank you so much for coming to this workshop. Let's talk about, in conclusion, how you feel about it now. In my opinion, UI and UX really matter. Maybe a lot more than a lot of games think that they do. They're the first impression that any player has on your game. They're seen before any in-game mechanics or art, and you should give them the time they deserve. I know I mentioned Persona 5 a lot here, but I do think that it's a game, though I do think the gameplay is really fun. The reason it is famous and has gone down in history is because of the UI. If it had boring UI, I don't think people would have paid attention to it, even if it is really fun to play. So UI can be the thing that makes people look at your indie game, especially since a lot of indie games don't have very advanced UI, and make them think that they've seen something worth looking at. Thinking about UI design in general is something that a lot of people might not do, and it could give your game an edge in a really competitive industry. Thank you guys so much for coming to this workshop and thinking about UI and UX design with me. If you didn't scan in at the beginning, because I know my audio was having a bit of an issue, please scan the QR code now, give us feedback, let us know what you thought of the workshop. And remember, if you didn't do that activity, please go and do it. I think that it would be really helpful. Yay! Glad you liked the presentation, mysterious person in chat. Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you, thank you. Please, if you have any questions also, let me know, because I would love to answer questions about this. I've been getting very into UI and UX design lately. I think it's pretty cool. There are so many more topics in it, too, that I just didn't have time, or I think it would be too much to throw at you at the same time in UI and UX design, like sound effects on UI to make them pop. Yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff. Okay, anyways, if there's no questions, I think I'll be wrapping up the workshop now. Thank you guys again so much for coming. I had a lot of fun running this. You guys have a great night.